Okay, welcome back everyone for the very exciting, risky, provocative interaction session. We're glad that you could make it back, and it's my real pleasure to introduce the moderator for this afternoon. His name, he's well known to you, of course, Vijay Pudusamy. Vijay is currently Director International and Public Affairs at the QI Group and President of the Hermes Air Transport Organization. He has over 30 years of experience, wide range experience in the field of air transport aviation. And actually, this is a good opportunity for me to indicate that all of the CVs of our presenters are uploaded to the symposium website. So many of them have extensive careers. We do not necessarily mention all of the activities that they were involved with over the years, but if you would like to know more about Vijay and all of the other participants, please consult the website and you'll be quite well informed as to their parcours, their experience over the years. In the interest of time, I think we've got all of our panels set up. The electronic equipment seems to be working, so it's my great pleasure to turn it over right away to our moderator for today. And I would ask for a very warm hand of applause for Vijay Pudusamy.
Merci. Bon après-midi, mesdames et messieurs.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. To all the participants here in this hall, and all of those who are following us on the live stream, welcome to the first interactive session of TRIP 2019. As Denis told you, my name is Vijay Pudusamy, and I am from Mauritius in Africa.
Understand that this novelty in TRIP symposia of an interactive session is designed to encourage you, urge you to actually participate and get involved in the discussions. A couple of pointers to set probably the stage for this discussion. As Denis have told you, I've been involved in international civil aviation for about 30 years. And I wish to probably start the discussion this afternoon by highlighting a couple of beliefs of mine. I believe that international air transport is global. By definition, it is global. And that its challenges must therefore be addressed uniformly at the global level by ICAO. My first question in this interactive session is, do you share that belief? Do you share that belief that global issues must be dealt with globally, and when it comes to international air transport, ICAO is the one and only venue for these decisions? If anybody disagrees, we're going to have a very, very lively interactive session. If you don't, I'll share with you another belief of mine. I believe that international air transport chain will never be stronger than its weakest link, and that all aviation stakeholders must support ICAO's formidable efforts to make the international air transport chain stronger, by ensuring that no country is left behind. Do you share that belief? Yes. Yes. It's an enthusiastic yes, or it's a yes, kind of a yes, a diplomatic yes? Now, I also believe that all stakeholders must be heard and must be involved in this critical work. So it's not just a matter of making sure states are not left behind, it's making sure that states are also heard, are involved. Do you agree with this? Yes. Yes. Well, we got a good start. Now, that's why I invite all of you here in this assembly hall and all of you who are following us live stream to fully participate in this interactive session live here or through the following email: tripsymposium@icao.int. The questions you'll be fielding, all of you, here and around the world through live stream, will be taken here. So it's not just you who will be participating in this session, it's all our friends and colleagues around the world who are within reach of an email address will send their questions through to us. Now, our goal, so that you understand what we are trying to achieve here, get your participation with the objective of providing valuable input to states and to ICAO in their endeavor to implement the ICAO's TRIP strategy. Now, I'm delighted to have our panelists for this first interactive session, number 5, and I introduce, starting from my immediate left, Christopher HORNEK, who is the ICAO project manager and passenger data exchange expert, right here. CÉLINE CANU, head of facilitation at IATA. Major Michael Jones, executive director, CARICOM Impacts. And THIERRY THIMON, project coordinator for Africa airport communication projects at AIRCOP in the regional office West and Central Africa in Senegal. Now, for your information, I think you know that we will not have presentations in this interactive session. That's why the presentations were actually posted on the ICAO TRIP website some time back, for you to be able to go through them so that we can go straight into a discussion and questions. But being realistic, I must first ask you another question. If you can just, by show of hands, indicate those of you who have actually gone through the presentations of our distinguished panelists in session 5. Just by show of hands. How many of you have actually gone through the presentations? Okay, we do have a handful. The reason I ask is I don't think it would be fair on you if we were to launch into a discussion on presentations you haven't had a chance to read. So, although this was meant not to have presentations, what I've asked our panelists to do is actually each of them to make a no more than 4 minutes summary of their respective presentations, the full length of which you can actually go on the website and see now or later. But I thought to allow us to get into a more meaningful interactive dialogue, I'll ask each panelist for no more than 4 minutes, and there'll be a timer for this, to actually give us a summary of their key messages in their presentations, starting with Christopher.
Well, thank you very much, Vijay, for that introduction to our session. And welcome to all of you to this interactive session. My presentation, my slides, and my bit here is about the ICAO legal framework for passenger data exchange systems, namely, and I will talk about Advanced Passenger Information, API, and Passenger Name Record data, PNR, both of which are contained in ICAO Annex 9, Chapter 9, Passenger Data Exchange Systems. As a brief summary, we can talk about batch API. This is a mandatory requirement under ICAO Annex 9 as standard 9.5. We have another form of API that's called interactive API, in which the data of a passenger is processed individually and sent immediately. This is on the level of a recommended practice, 9.14. We also have, of course, passenger name record data, which is on the level of a standard at provision 9.22. But this standard is conditional. It does not read as a mandatory requirement that states must implement PNR. However, of course, we have UN Security Council Resolution 2396, which under Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter is now mandating PNR transmission. And I think we will talk about this probably in our interactive discussion. Also contained in the annex are the references to the technical specifications for both API and PNR. In the case of API, these are maintained by the World Customs Organization, by IATA, and by ICAO as the API guidelines, and also the underlying message implementation guide for the PAX list message delivered in UN EDIFACT format. The PNR guidelines are a ICAO document. They are also referenced in Annex 9, and these PNR guidelines are ICAO document 9944. And they are the policy document which leads into the PNR message implementation guidelines, which are also maintained by the same three organizations, WCO, IATA, and ICAO, in the form, and that message can be delivered in a PADIS-based EDIFACT message. And even there are specifications for an XML version of that message. So, one final point for me is also the single window. Single window is provision 9.1 in Chapter 9, and it asks states to make greater law enforcement use of both API and PNR data, and to potentially combine the agencies which are receiving this data into a single window facility that processes both API and PNR more effectively and exploits those data for more law enforcement value and facilitation. Céline?
Thank you very much, Christopher. Céline?
Thank you, Christopher. I would like to take the opportunity also to thank ICAO and also for trying this setup, which is unusual, but I think might be very appropriate to discuss the implementation of API and PNR program. And although we are in a magnificent venue, which looks formal, we should all try to think that we are in a cozy little room, and please don't hesitate to ask questions, because it's where we learn, and we are really eager to do this exercise. On my side, and representing the Association for Airlines Worldwide, so IATA, the International Air Transport Association, I would like to emphasize that whenever we discuss and we talk about passenger data exchange, it is an exchange between states and air carriers. And today my words would be very much into trying to make you understand that yes, there are constraints and for states to implement API and PNR programs, but it's also important to understand that it's also a burden on carriers. So there are ways to do it in an efficient way, and this goes through dialogue. And my praise to states who are looking at implementing such programs, it's really to engage with carriers. They will be your best partners. You will not always have very easy dialogue and conversations with them. It might be hurtful, but it's also very much necessary if you want to implement an efficient program which is sustainable. Sustainable for your industry, but also sustainable for your economy. It is important to adhere to standards that Chris largely mentioned, and you will see in the documentation he has prepared for this conference. And you will see whenever you will engage with carriers, and this should happen at the earlier stage of your implementation program. So whenever you start planning, when you are thinking of implementing a program, please reach out to carriers, engage with them, have these open conversations about your plans, about the scope. It will be helpful also for them to propose you a plan, to tell you how they can put this program in place, what they need, how it's done elsewhere, what are the best practices, what type of problems you might encounter and therefore you might also avoid through this dialogue. And importantly, it doesn't stop here. Once you have a program in place, you should continue talking and engaging with carriers through workshops or through formal working groups. So it also helps you improving the quality of the data you receive. Some countries who have more mature program have understood that the data they receive is not always easy to use. So working with carriers will also help you refine the quality of the data provided. So what is important also to discuss with carriers right at the beginning is the scope of the program. What do you want to collect? What do you want to, and what purpose? Who in your state will receive the information, will need to have access to the information? Is it for immigration purposes? Is it for customs? Is it for security purposes? And all those questions are important because we understood also from Christopher that the notion of single window is crucial there. If several agencies need to receive this information, air carriers should not have to transmit to 3 different agencies at 3 different timings. So it's important to raise all those questions. Apply standards, have provisions in case of outage. Carriers will be extremely grateful. As you understand, the collection of API is done at time of checking. So whenever you implement also interactive API, they need an answer within 1 or 2 seconds to be able to let the passenger proceed. So please be prepared to have a plan B whenever things go wrong. And we know that with automation, it can go this way. The question of fines also, I'd like maybe to have the opportunity to discuss it today. When do you apply fines? When carriers don't provide the information, or when they provide information which is not really correct, but it's not in their hands? Or do you do with dual passport? So I'd be interested to discuss all those points with you today. And I'm sure we'll have a great conversation. So again, just imagine that we're in a small and cozy room and don't hesitate to raise questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Céline. Michael Jones?
Thank you. I also would like to express my appreciation for the opportunity to speak about our experience. And I represent CARICOM Impacts. So for all intents and purposes, we're speaking on behalf of the 15 full and 5 associate members of CARICOM. Now, my presentation had 6 slides, including the beginning and the end. The 4 in the middle really spoke about where we were, where we are, where we're going, and the contextual framework that is shaping our strategy. Now, as you may know, akin to what's happening now with Cricket World Cup, 2007, that essentially was the catalyst for the implementation of API in 10 of our member states. It was a prerequisite, one of the security prerequisites for hosting. I just remember you told me to speak slowly because of the interpretation, sorry. One of the security prerequisites was the implementation of API at that time. And though it was by sunset legislation, from the experiences observed and the successes then, it was retained ever since. So essentially, this is now 13 years that the Caribbean region has been using API. Over that time, there were a lot of lessons learned, and certainly it has been challenging basically to get several sovereign states to work together. I am pleased basically to say at this point, all 15 of the CARICOM member states do have legislation. The majority of them would have gone to the point of amending their legislation to include the requirement for PNR submissions as well. And the discussions, I imagine, would come out about some of the challenges there. I picked up some points that I would amend my 4-minute talk, as CÉLINE was talking about. And one of the good things about doing it as a group, essentially they're, for the most part, one address that carriers need to send the data to. So it comes to a central portal and is then distributed to the various stakeholders within the region. So there it negates the issue that CÉLINE was talking about, sending it to several stakeholders that require it, and thereby increasing the costs to airlines as well. Another key lesson learned over the period is that partnerships are crucial. So from day one, we've been very close partners with Interpol to the point where we've signed an MOU of cooperation back in March 2009, to the point in October last year at the General Assembly, permission was granted to establish a Caribbean Interpol liaison office within our premises in Barbados. And essentially that will serve a dual purpose in supporting the NCBs regionally, as well as not only giving wider access to the 19 databases that they have, but to support some of the other operations that we're looking to implement. Essentially, I know we're talking about API and PNR, but essentially what we're doing on the passenger side, we're also going to be doing for cargo as well, and firearms. So those are some of the things that we are rolling out. Other key partners as well would include UN ODC, particularly in the light of the AIRCOP program that they're running, and THIERRY would speak more about that. But essentially, you can't do it alone, and partnerships are key. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thierry Timon.
Merci, Vijay.
Thank you, Vijay.
Switch to French later. My name is Thierry Timon. Thanks to ICAO for having invited UNODC and AIRCOP project. I'm representing here AIRCOP, the AIRCOP project. What is AIRCOP? AIRCOP is a airport communication project, and it's implemented together by UNODC and Interpol and World Customs Organization, WCO. The goal of AIRCOP is the establishment of a real-time operational communication between international selected airports to fight transnational organized crime including drug trafficking and international terrorism. How do we do this? We support the implementation in the countries where the AIRCOP project is, of the establishment of what we call GAITF, Joint Airport Interdiction Task Forces, which role is advanced detection and then interception of high-risk passengers, but also suspicious cargo and postal parcels. The concept of a GAITF is an interagency concept because the unit is mixing at least two agencies, usually police, customs, but in many cases also immigration, intelligence services, and other agencies like civil aviation. And the job of this unit is risk analysis, profiling, targeting, interception of the suspicious passenger when we speak about passengers. And after, when they find something, if the person has a warrant of his carrying drugs or another illicit good, the case is given to the relevant agency. The project was launched in 2010 under the cocaine route program of the European Union. And so at the beginning it was mostly focused on cocaine trafficking coming from Latin America and Caribbean region, with final destination Europe with a transit in Africa. But now the working method has proved that lots of threats could be fought with that working method, not only cocaine, but also heroin, methamphetamine, and a lot of other threats, detection of potential foreign terrorist fighters, falsified medicine, cash couriers, wildlife crime, general aviation, control of postal parcels, and other all kind of threats impacting airport security or airline security. So what is the challenge? The challenge is in the context of passengers traffic, which will certainly double in 20 years. We have to find the right balance between the security concern of the countries and the legal and commercial concerns of the airlines, which are very legitimate. And we need to ensure a smooth air passengers traffic. So to avoid random controls, the GATF's job, they need to have access to do an accurate profiling. They need to have access to passengers data, which is API and PNR. API is authorizing our units, our GATFs, to do the identification of what we call the known passengers. Because, for example, if those passengers, if they are in the I-24/7 databases, because I forgot to tell that we provide all the GATFs with Interpol with the I-24/7 communication system, which is 17 criminal databases. And the WCO is providing us with CENTCOM, Customs Enforcement Network, and they have created a dedicated version of the CENTCOM for AIRCOP. And also our units, they are connected to those two systems. So with the I-24/7 of Interpol, we can identify what we name the known passengers. For example, people having a red notice or which appear in the national databases. Those people will be intercepted. But the PNR is authorizing the identification of what we call unknown passengers, which are passengers which doesn't appear in any database of Interpol or national database, but might be might also present very real potential dangers in terms of organized crime or terrorism. And how do we do this? We detect, we do the risk analysis with, for example, suspicious travel patterns. But unfortunately, so far, it's in most of the cases, it's based when the API is not implemented. It's based on the local agreements on airports between the law enforcement and the airlines. And depending of the country, the same airline can be very cooperative in one country and face more legal issues in another country and be more reluctant to provide the passengers' data with a PNR. That's why the AIRCOP project has joined very recently a very important project called One UN Counterterrorism Travel Program. It was launched officially last month in New York on the 7th of May. And it's the goal of this project, One UN Counterterrorist Travel Program, is building the capacity of member states to prevent, detect, and investigate terrorist offenses and related travel by using API and PNR. And it's in line with the UNSC resolution 2396, as mentioned by the colleague. I'm finishing. This project is implemented by UNOCT, United Official of Counterterrorism, and Counterterrorism Executive Directorate, OICT, the Office for Information and Communication Technology, ICAO, and UNODC with AIRCOP for the implementation, operationalization of the Passenger Information Unit, which should become the single window, as mentioned by my colleagues. And on the airport where the AIRCOP is present, we hope that the GATF will be the PIU, and also from UNODC side, the terrorism prevention branch for the legislative assistance to the states. And I'm finishing. There is 4 stages to this project. First is assessment. We are now in the assessment phase because the project just started. Legislative assistance, the setup of the PIU, and the support maintenance for the API PNR with the software.
Merci, Thierry.
Thank you.
Sorry.
You have the 4 presentations in a relatively fast-track mode. What you have to bear in mind now, we have the email address, tripsymposium@icao.int, where you can put any of your questions or comments, and you can also, those in the room here, just raise your hands, and I'll direct you to actually raise your question or comments in the proceedings. As you do, as Michael reminded us, do please try to speak as slowly as possible to allow the interpreters to actually do their great job. But when you write the email questions, you can write very fast. That's not a problem. So, some questions are already coming through on the email, and just raise your hands if you want any question. You heard the panelists mention the API and then the PNR issue. Now, you all know that ICAO has made it a standard in Annex 9.5 for contracting states to establish an API system. It's a mandatory standard. The UN Security Council also has a resolution on API, but it also has a resolution on PNRs. I'm going to actually bring that subject up first because it is rather complex and sometimes confusing issue when it comes to legal regimes and data protection and so on. So maybe I'll start with Christopher. Again, perhaps briefly, but helpfully, help us understand this dynamics between API and PNR. Christopher.
Okay, well, thank you, Vijay. It's good to start with the easy questions.
It gets easier afterwards.
Yeah, I hope so. Well, as described, we have more or less a global regime and a more or less global agreement on advanced passenger information, API, being delivered from airlines or aircraft operators and their agents to requesting states. And it seems it's a very relatively straightforward issue. The core of this message really is the passport. And so if you're prepared to travel and enter a state, you're prepared to present your passport. So in this sense, there's really very little that could be deemed controversial. Passenger name record is more or less commercial data, which is self-asserted and presented and recorded in various forms, including self-asserted information that the passenger or someone acting on his or her behalf enters when making the reservation. And we've come to the situation that these programs are rising throughout the world in their use, but we have not reached a political and or legal agreement on the protection of that data, the storage, eventual redaction, and how that data is treated, used, and otherwise stored. And one of the provisions that I didn't mention is recommended practice 9.23, which is recommends that states who do not agree in legal terms should seek legal agreements to resolve this situation. And that provision came in a few years ago at the 9th Facilitation Panel. So far, there haven't been any new agreements, and specifically I'm talking about the European Union and its desire to regulate data transfers coming from the European space to states requesting that data. So what has been done? We have now, of course, Security Council Resolution 2396, thank you, which is mandating PNR as a global requirement. And within ICAO, at the facilitation panel, at the 10th facilitation panel, it was decided that a new working group would be formed and was formed, and this is the PNR task force. And this task force is dealing with this issue within ICAO to essentially fast track, or with a view to fast tracking this provision also to become a mandatory requirement, essentially requesting and requiring all states to request this information, PNR information, from aircraft operators. That, however, still does not necessarily resolve that political impasse. And so the questions which are arising about how will this data be treated when it's collected, when it's transferred, when it's processed and used and stored. And these are the very big questions, which maybe some of my other panelists can also share their opinion on, but maybe we can also hear from the audience. But in general, there could be the attempt, and I would go, and within the task force, we have also discussed this issue that the guidelines themselves, the PNR guidelines, which are guidance documents, a guidance document, already contains a good deal of information and guidance about how this data is used, processed, and stored. And to elevate some of these elements into the legal environment, which hopefully will help to resolve some of that. That is sort of my introduction to that problem statement.
Okay, thank you. But now you will recognize that the legal certainty which surrounds these systems are necessary. Now, if you look at Annex 9.6, there's another standard there which requires states to ensure that the API system is supported by appropriate legal authority and are consistent with internationally recognized standards for API. So on the one hand, you have this mandatory commitment to actually provide a legal basis for your PNR API, but then you have these complex...
and I think, the API provisions really also provide us with some guidance in this sense. The PNR provisions will also need to, and from my perspective, need to say, yes, A, it needs to be mandatory, and B, it needs to be lawful within that jurisdiction space. There needs to be a law which outlines not only that this data is being requested, but the use and the purpose and how they will treat this data and potentially with whom they might share it with as well. That is something that an airline will most certainly insist upon as well. In addition to that mandatory requirement, it is not really possible for a customs administration to come to an airline and say, I want PNR.
Let me follow up to this now. If you look at the legal basis and the standard on the legal provisions, and if you look at Annex 9.7, which reads, and I would urge you to basically work with me on that. It basically says, each contracting state developing legislation for the purpose of implementing an API system should consider developing aligned regulations that meet the needs of all involved agencies, define a common set of API data elements required for that jurisdiction in accordance with message construction standards, and appoint one government agency to receive API data on behalf of all other agencies. Right? It's very clear, very detailed, very much in line to our earlier discussion about the need to have uniformity in global rules. So my question to CÉLINE, why is 9.7, which set out very clear and very rational, very reasonable provisions, why is 9.7 not a standard?
We hope that it might change in the near future.
True, no, but why is it not a standard? Why is it only a recommended practice? When, I mean, anybody here disagrees with any of the provisions of 9.7. Do you think that any of those provisions there are either unreasonable or really contrary to the objective of a common, uniform system for international civil aviation? It's a genuine question I'm putting to all of you. And please raise your hand and tell me I'm wrong. Tell me, yes, this should be probably not even a recommended practice. What do you say, Céline?
I think there's also some historical background, behind each of the legal provisions that are embedded in Annex 9 or in a legislative text. Initially, the advanced passenger information was sent in advance of a flight and was essentially sent to customs or immigration, depending on the agency in the country we were in charge of the border security process. Now, and we heard from my colleague before and during those last 2 days that the UN Security Council is bringing a new dimension to the global picture. Some countries had already been using API data for risk assessment, certainly, but now this UN Security Council requests all the states to collect API data for security reasons as well. So, whereas before there was no, it was not a question to wonder how many agencies also would receive the data. Now, as it increases and the police wants to have the information, the secret services, the customs, the immigration, sometimes also the tourism agencies for statistics and then it becomes very complicated to manage. So I think there's been very good discussions, and particularly during the last panel, and member states recognize that with the increasing number of agencies who are asking to get some access to API and PNR data, the establishment of a single window for passenger data was necessary. And air carriers can only send the data in one format, and then it will be up to the state and the agency in charge of the single window to allow the access to the passenger data, so basically their identity and some basic flight information on need to know, need to access basis, depending of the need for them to get access to the information. So yes, it's a recommended practice, but there are, good chances that it becomes a standard.
Okay, and you raised the single window. If I could probably put the same question to the panel, and indeed to all of you. 9.1, Annex 9.1, refers to the single window facility for each data category. My question again is, why is 9.1 only a recommended practice? If the single window is so great, why are we not opening that window bigger? Michael, do you have a single window in CARICOM?
He has more.
I can't answer why you're not, it is not the standard, but certainly we have been beneficiary of our cooperation in that regard. Because essentially the member states within CARICOM would have legislated it to make it mandatory, and they would have named our organization as the recipient on their behalf. And from that portal then it would be sent to the different stakeholders within the member states that require it, thus negating the requirement for multiple submissions and the like, even in support of programs like AIRCOP. Because I remember when UN ODC came to the region and they were looking at selling, so to speak, the AIRCOP program, we basically indicated that it couldn't be done, it couldn't be replicated in the region as was done in Africa and so on, because for all intents and purposes, we were already doing the same thing already. But one of the reasons why we supported it is because of the jointness that you hear THIERRY talked about. In some of our member states, you had immigration, customs, police, even Intel. Although they're working for the same state, they are not cooperating and sharing with each other. So that jointness forced them to basically subject themselves to the standard vetting. And as a consequence of that, it engendered trust, and you got a richer intelligence picture being presented. And then likewise, if we're already receiving it on the behalf of the member state, then there's no need for you to ask that airline. It's just another fee to another entity within the member state. So, those are some win-wins that we were able to realize. I can suspect, though, that even though it's in the case of one country, that unless you have identified a unitary lead, that one ministry may say, well, I can legislate this way, and so on and so forth, which does not is not efficient. And it is better if cooperation was done in that regard. Matter of fact, in one member state now, we have a challenge, so to speak, where they want to get rid of the ED forms. The recommendation, and again with the partnership, we've been working very closely with IATA in this regard. The recommendation that was made to government in terms of looking at an electronic ED card to be filled out, they don't want. We do recognize that some of the information that they're looking for, particularly for the statistical and tourism entities, could be obtained in the PNR data. But as tourism-dependent economies, with a lot of our tourists coming from the European side, and you've already referred to the conundrum of 2396 and the EU GDPR, we're not going to get that data from the EU side anytime soon. So it's a bit of a challenge as to how you're going to satisfy that requirement given the conditions that the political directive set. But it makes sense and it has been working for us, and perhaps others can follow suit where possible.
Okay, thank you very much. We actually have Ms. Narges Abdenabi here from ICAO, and she probably can enlighten us as to the why. But before she does, I'm going to throw in another subject of discussion. Now, interactive API is a recommended practice, right? And presumably because it's recognized that interactive API is more complex, more costly, and so it's up to states whether they want to adopt it or not. It's a recommended practice. The question I have is, for states which choose to adopt interactive API, shouldn't they be under the obligation to adopt the other recommended practices connected with interactive API? See, it's your choice. You choose to adopt interactive API. There are a number of other recommended practices connected with interactive API. If you choose to adopt one, shouldn't you be under obligation to adopt all? Because they all, it's like a package deal. That's a question which I want to put to the panel, and then I'll ask Narges to intervene on both. Why the single window is a recommended practice, and why is it not possible for states which choose to embrace interactive API, they should not be under the obligation to adopt all the interactive API recommended practices. Anyone wants to jump in? Anybody in the audience wants to throw in? Yes, please. My friend from Netherlands.
Thank you, Vijay. First, a little enlightenment on 9.1. 9.1 has been raised to a standard. Last panel was a proposal from the Netherlands, so that is one care less in the sense that 9.1, a single window, is a standard when it is now published. So there's good news there. But even when you make it a standard, then still it is a question what happens when you go outside of the standards, and what kind of tools does an airline have when a country goes outside of the standards. For example, Mr. HORNEK enlightened us on the WCO, IATA, ICAO guidelines for API. Still, there are countries that go outside those guidelines, ask more than just flight information, border information, and passport information. My question to the airline representative is there a possibility that airlines can make a stand collectively against states who do not comply with the standards? And the the other question, maybe Mrs. Narjes can enlighten us on that, the kind of role ICAO may play when bilateral agreements do not give the result that states need as displayed with the PNR. Those were my questions, and the comment on 9.1 is a happy one, so thank you.
Thank you very much. Narjes.
Thank you, Vijay, and good afternoon to all. In fact, Dianta answered part of what I wanted to say, which is that effectively the facilitation panel discussed the move from this recommended practice to a standard. It was discussed at the Council, and this standard should become effective with the Amendment 27 to Annex 9. This is planned for October 2019. Regarding your second question related to the link to IAPI, indeed I have in mind one recommended practice when a state is willing to implement electronic travel system. It is recommended to link it to IAPI, but this is not the case of all states as per today. It could be perhaps part of the discussion of the next facilitation panel meeting planned in 2020. Finally, regarding the question of Dianta regarding the PNR, I would say that perhaps today it is too early to answer this kind of question, especially that there is a dedicated task force working under the facilitation panel toward this PNR future provisions. And of course, here in ICAO, we are always favoring the issue of a multilateral agreement than bilateral ones. And as an example, we can cite, of course, the PKD facility, but this is only an example. The other example that I have also in mind is the facility that we have implemented since now more than 10 years in order to facilitate arrangements between states regarding their air services agreement. And we are hoping, of course, to go further for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good to know there's actually some very interactive work going on right as we speak on these issues. One of our participants is curious if there's been discussion on adding a biometric face to the API information. Is that a yes? Anybody knows the answer to this? Has there been discussion about biometric, I suppose, face recognition as part of the API information? No? No, nobody's aware. So,
yeah, I mean, maybe I'll give it a try. The biometric information is part of the information you will have on the passport and part of the passenger identification. Now, if we look at the current standards on API and on the way API data are currently transmitted, it would be extremely challenging to transmit the biometric picture or the biometric template directly within the message, the existing message. That's maybe one of the aspects. Now, there are a number of developments, and be it from a security standpoint, where the UN 2396 also mandate the collection of biometric data. We know that there are a number of initiatives, including from IATA, to use biometric data to facilitate the recognition of passenger within the airport environment, but also ahead of the trip. So we have to look at how to, I mean, first, is there a need to transmit this information? because we see that there are some trials that are being run and that might not necessarily be the need for it. So therefore, you would not have to directly link it to the API as we know them now. Another alternative also is, and maybe now we're going to enter into questions that hurt, but historically the airlines have been tasked by states to collect passenger information because they were the only stakeholder to meet with the passenger before they even reach the country of destination. So the states have delegated this mission to collect passenger information to the airlines. Now, states are also requesting API at departure. So can states maybe do it themselves at departure? That could be one point. But also technology has evolved, and even if you don't necessarily have a direct interaction or physical interaction with a passenger, could you ask him, her, this information in advance directly? So behind this question, and it's not an easy one, do we want to have biometric information in the API message? That could be one avenue. It's currently not the cheapest and maybe not the easiest, but it's not a close debate. But shouldn't we be looking also at different ways of transmitting this information if we want to transmit it? We've been talking about digital identity, we've been talking about tokenization of the passenger identity on a mobile phone. So those are also other avenues that should be explored and that we are exploring. I mean, at IATA most certainly under our OneID project, but other organizations and hopefully states, and we are very grateful for that.
Thank you. Actually, there's a question, actually two questions which relate to this historical context you mentioned. And the question basically is asking whether the panel thinks that the transfer of passengers' travel document information should be between states involved directly and not necessarily involve the airlines.
I think it's going to make it far more complicated than it is already.
So for simplicity's sake, you prefer the airlines to handle that?
I meant it more from a political and legal perspective.
Which ends up being a practical situation as well. Now, Jess. Yeah, you go. Oh, it was on. Yes.
Okay. Just to come back on the question on the biometrics, first to confirm that officially and through a standard, only the photo is the biometric mandatory based on ICAO standards and specifications. The other ones, fingerprints and iris scan, are not mandatory as per today. And during the lunch break, we were discussing informally regarding also the link to the question that was asked this morning regarding the morphing. If I take my personal case, some years ago when you have to renew your passport, the photo was taken at the consulate. So this was the possibility not to have any possibility of morphing, in fact. And based on the lobby of the photographs, this has been abandoned. And of course, it is the preferred action to avoid any kind of morphing. Now regarding the link of the photo, because here we are only talking about the biometric photo, the biometric which is linked to the photo, which is mandatory in the passport. And here perhaps I will ask the comment from the technical experts from the tag. My understanding is that in the current generation of e-passport, when you are reading the machine readable zone, it can be, and this is the way the API is transmitted, it can be linked to the photo. And perhaps I will ask Mike Hawley to intervene here.
Yep, thank you very much. There you go.
I'm sorry?
It just takes a moment.
Yeah, Michael.
Okay. Okay, good afternoon. The e-passport, the data stored within the logical data structure, when someone accesses the e-passport, all data groups are available except those data groups that store the secondary biometric if the country issuing authority has stored a second biometric. So we've talked about, as part of the digital travel credential specifications, of course we're going to be extracting data group 1 and 2 along with the SOD from the e-passport. Actually, I spoke with Chris at one time, to be honest, about including the face biometric as part of the API message, and for one reason or another, at least I interpreted that it would be not difficult, but certainly something that perhaps the airlines would not want to do. Narges, did I respond to your question correctly? The fact is, whoever reads the passport can extract the biometric without difficulty.
And,
I didn't mean to put Chris on the line, but I do recall this conversation.
I recall it well too, Mike. And but I think CÉLINE is already, she's just given the airline bit, and sure, I mean, it always has to be a trade-off about what is that cost going to get the entire industry, and the security and the facilitation value that's going to come out of it. But maybe, and I just wanted to back it up one step and go back to the annex, and we also have standard 9.8, and that's really about data quality, and it requests that the API data elements are more or less limited to the machine readable zone of a passport, meaning that this is then machine-assisted data capture, which increases the data quality of that transmission, and that states can hopefully trust this even more, this passport data that's coming in. Of course, in the meantime, you really don't see the airline agent anymore, and that swipe kind of is going away, and you're entering this data now with your fingers. But in the future, and it's already happening, then you can read in the machine readable zone through your phone as a data capture. And it's already also, you can also extract potentially DG1 with your phone and maybe upload it into the online web and check-in. The question is, at some point, will DG1 and DG2 be transmitted as part of the message? And that's the next step, but it certainly would also provide for enhanced data quality as well, if you're going to take that step of validation. But the question is, then we have the question, who is going to send API data? And really it is the airlines that are interacting with the passenger, collecting the data and sending it. So do they have this capability? Do they have the interest to invest? Can there be a joint investment?
Okay. Just one quick question to all of you. We started this session 15 minutes late. If you're okay, we'll just finish at that revised time for the coffee break, so which means another 10 minutes more. You okay?
Yes.
Thank you. You'll have double coffee after that. If I may, and Céline, if you can think, there's a question which came through in terms of what can IATA do to help states which are trying to establish an API PNR system. So as you think about that response, I want to put two practical questions to our panelists. The interactive API is designed to basically have a live check on a passenger at the time of check-in, right? As to whether that person would be allowed to check in or not. And that is typically envisaged to be at an airport. But as you know, probably most of you do that, increasingly people check in online, not at the airport. So my question then is how is the system geared to capture online check-in? That's my first question. Maybe we'll deal with that. I have a second one, which is a bit more fun, but let's try this one out first. Who would like to? Céline? Online check-in.
It's an important question for us, and I'm glad you raised it, Vijay. It gets back to one of the comments we had earlier on the interaction and the link between the implementation of IAPI program and the interoperability of the ETS, the electronic travel system. And as you mentioned, whenever states implement an IAPI program, they need to be able to provide a quick answer to the airline, meaning in 2-3 seconds, of whether the person who's checking is able to, will be most probably be able to enter the country. Does he have the appropriate authorization? Does he hold these ETS or visa? And it's a very sensitive time for the carriers because it might be at home, so whenever you process through online checking or mobile checking, but it might be also at the airport, and you can all figure out those long lines and queues at the checking counters. So the process has to be fast. One key element also is that as states apply standards and they restrict the data element for API and IAPI to the machine-readable zone, so they will also allow the automation of the passenger process at the airport. And this is important. We are talking about biometric recognition. You cannot decently have biometric recognition when at the starting point, at the collection of passenger data, there is no standardization. When airlines have to enter the information manually. It also opens the room for including errors, mistakes in the information provided on the passenger information. So the quality of the data that states will have will be seriously deteriorated. So our praise is really to implement standards, the easiest, the baseline, and you will be able to automate the process to have good data quality and to have to be able to run your risk assessment.
Thank you very much. You want to add anything to this? Thierry or Michael? No. If not, Thierry, can I ask you, because in your presentation on AIRCOP, you mentioned this was implemented by the UN UN's Office on Drug and Crime with, in partnership with Interpol and World Customs Organization. What's the connection with ICAO now or going forward?
We have, DC have signed an MOU with ICAO last year, I think it was in May 2018, and in the frame of the AIRCOP project, the challenge is, of course, the access to the passenger data. And API is essential, but PNR is even better for our purpose, because we are in a law enforcement approach of interdiction approach, and it's only with PNR that you can have certain like the cash payment or not, the time of the booking. For example, if we speak only about drug trafficking, for example, a lot of drugs is coming from Brazil, from Sao Paulo airport to Africa, and the way to target passengers is, for example, late booking 1 or 2 days before, cash payment for European passengers, which is not normal in Africa, but very unusual for European passengers. Reservation changed 2 or 3 times in 1 week, so which is also suspicious. So all those details are only in the PNR.
Thank you. There's one more question in terms of, and I think, Christopher, you explained that earlier, but perhaps you could, in no more than 2 minutes, make it crystal clear what is this privacy issue when it's connected with PNR.
Well, I think Thierry has just mentioned it as it's a good lead-in to that, I hope. I think that the value of, the way I understand it, is that the value of PNR is there because it can help you discover things that you don't know. And at the same time, it allows you to take a given rule of a suspicious pattern and apply it to the data you've received. And I think that's just a fundamental societal question about how far do you want to go to protect yourself as a state, and to take the information on an incoming flight or outbound flight and say, okay, I have this rule that potentially everyone on the flight might be trafficking narcotics or not. And so in some cases, obviously this is very useful. I think it's a question that's going to be very public, and so I think very good arguments have to be made, very succinct. So I'll try to make those as well. I think that you see that in particular cases, the value of that is really very high. And of course, quote unquote, the problem with that is that when you do this type of police work or law enforcement work, the success that you have must in some form remain hidden because you will blow your own cover. So potentially, and I hope that the problem here is more or less, I think, related to data retention and use, and potentially also international sharing. At the same time, the PNR is very different from the API. It can be potentially contain a whole number of personal elements. Just as an abstract one, passengers with reduced mobility. So you want to have this passenger be met with a wheelchair or something like this. This really has, well, maybe it does have law enforcement, right? So I don't know. I'm not well versed enough to say that, but there are elements there that really sometimes the normal citizen asks himself, why? And I think that's the question.
Okay. Thank you very much. There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. I promise you we'll finish with our 15-minute extension. And what I'd like you to invite, actually, is to give a big round of applause to Christopher, Céline, Michael, and Thierry for their interventions and insights. Thank you very much. And to all of you, I mean, this was your first warm-up for an interactive session. The real one starts after the coffee break, which is actually sponsored by Entrust. So I guess you can trust the coffee you'll drink. So enjoy the coffee break, and we'll come back here. Denis?
Around 3 o'clock.
It's 3:30 now. It's difficult to come at 3. So
Let's try 4.
4 o'clock, probably better bet. So 4 o'clock for the next interactive session. Thank you very much. Thank you.